Over the past 2 decades, the LGBTQ community has started regaining public approval. But where has this community of people come from? Who are the people who stood out in history for their defiance against their times? Due to this community being so big and diverse, we will be focusing on homosexual and transgender history. Predating Christianity, the Han Dynasty had some very well-known bisexual and homosexual icons and rulers. Emperor Ai of Han and Long Yang were very valorized throughout China. Many Hindu texts portray homosexual activity, one of the more popular texts being the Kama Sutra, as it affirms same-sex relations. All throughout the early world, there was acceptance for sexual and gender identities. Ancient Greece became a popular place for homosexual activity, as it is described to both flourish between both men and women. But history goes to show that this peace and acceptance did not last forever. The Bible made it very clear that homosexuality was a sin that no one could repent from. This idea that homosexuality, transgender, and everything else was a very bad sin that was punishable by death for many civilizations, Christian missionaries successfully changed the history's course of acceptance of themselves forever. One of the early recorded times was in 1206 when the Mongol Empire formed in China, and Genghis Khan made homosexual activity punishable by death. As time went on, other Asian cultures either died out or lost a lot of its core of life to Christian missionaries enforcing their beliefs onto others. Nowadays, though, a study in 2020 revealed that only 25.8% of religiously affiliated Americans are against protections for the LGBTQ community, though due to social media, it seems like a way higher percentage. In 2000, the Netherlands became the first country to legalize same-sex marriage. A survey done by The Economist showed that 45% of Asian Pacific populations believed that same-sex marriage was inevitable, while 31% disagreed on that. The first Central American country to legalize same-sex marriage is Costa Rica in 2020.
Now, let's do a deep dive into the United States. Sodomy had been outlawed in all of the colonies by 1714 and were not abolished until 1925. During the Revolutionary War, it is believed that many homosexual men had fought as soldiers within the Continental Army. The most notable duo being Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence, as they wrote what can be described as intimate letters to each other. One of the first well-documented LGBTQ groups is the Society of Human Rights, founded by Henry Gerber in 1924. This group was quickly disbanded within months due to the negative public and political pressure it was receiving. Around 1941, a physician named Harry Benjamin believed and pioneered the start of hormone therapy for people who felt they were assigned the wrong gender at birth. He would care for many people and transition them free of pay, even when it became illegal to do. He was born in Germany, then moved to Denmark and stayed there for a while until eventually living the rest of his life out in New York due to World War I. In 1966, he published a book called The Transsexual Phenomenon, which became a very important piece of work that described and explained affirmative treatment. In 1953, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed Executive Order 10450, which banned homosexuals from working and started the removal of said people from jobs. This became known as the Lavender Scare, which caused more than 4,380 homosexual men and women to be discharged from military services and more than 500 from jobs. In 1969, Greenwich Village, New York City, LGBTQ rioted for 3 days against the police who had been trying to take down a gay bar called the Stonewall Inn. This event is commemorated every year on June 28th as Christopher Saint Liberation Day. In the following year of this event, the first Pride Parade happened, where thousands of LGBTQ people marched through New York and into Central Park. Later, in 2016, the first LGBTQ monument was built, called the Stonewall National Monument, which is to represent the Stonewall Inn's uprising. After the AIDS epidemic in 1993, the Department of Defense prohibited the military from asking someone their sexual orientation to allow them to secretly serve. This became known as the Don't Ask, Don't Tell Act. 17 years later, in 2010, this act is repealed to allow homosexuals to openly serve. The first Supreme Court case to address discrimination against sexual orientation from state laws happened in 1996 with the Romer v. Evans case. Lasting roughly 8 months, Evans and others argued against Colorado's governor that Colorado's Second Amendment was unconstitutional as it denied gays and lesbians protection from discrimination. In 1998, the widow of MLK Jr., Coretta Scott King, tried to get the civil rights community to join forces with the LGBTQ community against homophobia and discrimination, to which she received criticism from civil rights members for comparing civil rights to gay rights. Vermont became the first state to legalize civil unions and registered partnerships between same-sex couples in 2000. Sodomy laws became unconstitutional in Texas in 2003 after the Lawrence versus Texas case. The following year, in 2004, Massachusetts legalizes same-sex marriage, with 5 other states following after throughout the next 6 years. The Matthew Shepard and James Beard Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act was passed and signed into law in 2009, which expands the federal hate crime law to include criminal motivations based on the victim's actual or perceived gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. This act is named after Matthew Shepard, who was tortured and murdered by Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson in Wyoming due to his sexual orientation in 1998. Russell had pleaded guilty to kidnapping and first-degree murder in April of 1999 and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. McKinney was also sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole and was charged with kidnapping, aggravated robbery, and second-degree murder on November 4, 1999. James Beard Jr. is also named with this act for his brutal and racist-motivated murder in 1998 in Texas. In 1896, an unnamed lesbian novel was written that later in 1914 would be the first documented American motion picture film to show bisexual characters. In 1974, at the age of 21, Kathy Kozachenko was the first openly gay American to be elected to public office on the Michigan City Council. In 1976, the New Jersey Superior Court case MT vs. JT ruled that trans people can marry under the basis of the gender they identify as and not the gender they were assigned at birth. Wisconsin became the first law to outlaw discrimination in employment, housing, credit, education, and all public accommodation environments on the basis of sexual orientation in 1982. All 50 states legalized same-sex marriage in 2015 by the Supreme Court in the Obergefell v. Hodges case, challenging the refusal to recognize same-sex marriage on death certificates. In 2016, the ban prohibiting transgenders from openly serving in the military was lifted, but in the following year, Trump rebans transgenders from serving, which doesn't become a policy until next year. In 2017, the District of Columbia became the first residence to allow a gender-neutral option on driver licenses and identification cards. Danica Rowan became the first openly transgender person to be elected into the Virginia House of Delegates in 2018. In late 2020, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in favor of Gavin Grimm that segregating transgender students from their peers is unconstitutional and violates federal law. Sarah McBride became the first transgender to serve as a state senator. Marie Turner became the first non-binary state legislator in Oklahoma. In 2021, President Biden signs an executive order appealing Trump's ban on transgenders being able to join the military. Dr. Rachel Levine becomes the first transgender federal official. The State Department has added an X gender on U.S. passports and CRBA for those who don't identify as male or female. This last October, the Social Security Administration announced that people can now choose their sex marker in their Social Security records.
Many more milestones and events are to happen, as well as setbacks, as that is human nature. Unfortunately, even today, with all of these laws enacted for the LGBTQ community, there is still a lot of discrimination and laws trying to be put in place against them. People will have to change the way they live in order to avoid unequal treatment. Depending on where one lives, they cannot have the rights to the treatment they need, as states are enacting bills preventing trans people from getting the medical treatment they deserve.
In the end, we're all different people, but still human regardless. It shouldn't matter how someone perceives himself or who they're attracted to, as long as by the end of the day, the person is happy with who they are and who they're with. That's all that should matter. We as a society are not there yet due to personal beliefs in certain people in power. It's taking longer than it should. This community has been around longer than what most people believe and have made themselves known to the world that they are there. They made their presence known and they haven't been heard as their history doesn't make it into schools. Many people have become the icons of this community's timeline throughout history, and this community isn't done making more.